morning. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all to this very strategic conversation this morning here at the Baha'i Community Center. And before I start the conversation, I just wanted to, I just have an highlight for our non-speakers panelists. We have one Francophone panelist, we have one Spanish-speaking panelist, and one Portuguese-speaking panelist. We are asked that you speak, you sentence or so, and then you hold, so that the translator can translate what you are saying, and then you continue. So it's to take a slow pace to allow the translator to be able to translate what you are saying. So that is the only, I think, announcement that I had to make this morning. So once again, you're welcome. This conversation today is a very critical conversation that we all need to speak to. And we all know that finances are very critical for Indigenous foundations, Indigenous peoples and local communities. And to date, we know that these finances have trickled down very slowly. They have not really reached the people that need these finances. We have the Green Climate Fund, which we know that has very stringent regulations that makes it very difficult for local communities and Indigenous people to access. The regulations for developing bankable proposals are really difficult for communities to develop those proposals. So it makes it very difficult. And in Glasgow last year during COP26, more money was announced by the international community, $1.7 billion to go to the global south, particularly to Indigenous peoples. It is almost 12 months now. We are going into COP27 in Egypt, and we have not seen that money. So I think we only justify to discuss and to ask where that money is. So it is for this reason that the FSC Indigenous Foundation, in collaboration with Global Women Leaders, Voices for Voices and Inclusion, the CED for UN, and USAID decided to organize this meeting to discuss this critical topic for today. And we are very privileged also to have speakers today in this conversation who are very experienced, and they are bringing many years of experience to the table to discuss these things, to discuss this conversation today with us. So without much ado, I will first and foremost ask the leaders of the co-organizers to do their welcoming remarks. And I would like to start with Dr. Francisco Souza, who is the MD, the Managing Director for the FSC Indigenous Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Souza.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start to thank you, the USAID, for being together with us on this very important conversation today. Also, the GWL and the UN that you need for organize this event today. So, as Salina explained, from the Indigenous Foundation perspective, we see this conversation is extremely important. I'm a member of the Apurina Indigenous people from the Brazilian Amazon. For the Indigenous people worldwide, we look the conversation about the climate change as an opportunity, windows of opportunity for us to create cross-collaboration. Cross-collaboration between and among different sectors. We do have the solution. We do have knowledge. The solution, the knowledge that we have so far is not from today, is not from yesterday, but is from centuries and centuries that came from the way how we manage our territories. The conversation today is about the future. But for us, for the Indigenous people in local community, to think about the future, it's important to think about the past. Because if you think about the past, we need to recognize, you need to respect the past. You need to learn from the past. Because the past is for us the guidance. They provide the guidance for us to think about the future. But to think about the future, to recognize, to respect the past, we should think about it today. In today, the situation that we see on the planet is that when you think about the climate change, it's important to think about the health. It's important to think about the health. It's also important to think about financial. It's important to think about the economy. But and when indigenous people in local community, we think about the future, connect with the past, we think about today, we are also have here the opportunity about the importance for us to think about the potential risk for the future. The opportunity to bring together the indigenous people as part of this conversation in local community, of course, is the opportunity to reduce risk. It's the opportunity for us to create a shared value, to safeguard the planet. It should be everyone on the same boat for us to create effective solution. If you ask me, what would be the contribution for indigenous people in local community as part of this conversation, negotiation for us to think together about the solution for the planet is to safeguard the planet, to save the planet, to reduce the risk for everyone. We have a very important asset. The asset that we have, the asset that we bring to the table is the knowledge, is the mother nature, is the forest that you have protected for centuries and centuries. That's a key asset for us to reduce the risk for everyone for the future. This conversation today is to think about different models. On the conversation nowadays about the climate change, climate finance, is very common to hear that we should improve the capacity of the indigenous people in local community organization for them to be able to lead, for them to be able to facilitate, to negotiate, to build up collaboration. But the indigenous people in local community, we do have centuries and centuries of experience. We have the knowledge. We have the possibility to contribute. We have the possibility to put on the table real solution that we are going to have the power to create effective solutions together. So today, we are going to talk and to share with you different models. We have already different models led by indigenous people as part of the efforts for us to create solutions for the different challenges that we are facing nowadays. The Indigenous Foundation, together with different indigenous partners that we are together on these efforts at the global level, we would like to talk to you today about the indigenous lead models that we think would be the opportunity for us to scale up and to speed on the effective solution for the climate change, the challenge that we're facing nowadays with the planet. So again, I'm very happy to have this dialogue with you today. I think this is a critical opportunity for us to integrate different sectors and to think not only about the climate change, but again, for us to think about the future. But don't forget that to think about the future, we need to think about the past. You need to think today. You have the solution already. We need just to implement, to speed, to scale up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those opening remarks. So indigenous people have lived in harmony with nature for millions of years. So they have the capacities, the abilities, they have the solutions. We need to give them the opportunity to bring those solutions to the table. And as Dr. Sousa says, we have to think, learn from the past to look into the future and come up with models that will work for indigenous peoples in the creation of solutions for that. Thank you so much for those remarks. Now I would like to move on to introduce our next co-organizer, who would also give us her opening remarks, Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa. She is representing the Global Women Leaders and Inclusion, but also representing, I'm told, C for UN, that is not able to attend today. So Ms. Espinosa, welcome.
Thank you very, very much, Halima. And you have no idea how much I would have liked to be physically with you, because I am in New York. I'm not very far away from you, but I had a previous commitment that it's about to start here in a few minutes about UN reform. I'm really very, very happy to address this conversation convened by USAID, MSC, Indigenous Foundation, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance for Rights and Development, the Climate Group, our Coalition for the UN We Need, and GWL that are co-sponsoring this event today. So I think that the issue that brings us together in learning and repeating the words of the previous speakers, we need to go from words to action. We really need to use the wisdom and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples to scale up nature-based solutions for climate adaptation, but also for mitigation and resilience building. So basically, I think that it is important to have the narrative right, to understand that climate change is not the problem, but it is a symptom of a broken relationship between society, politics, our economic models, and nature. So basically the call here is for a reconciliation between humans and nature. And if we talk about stewardship, about understanding that we are one and we have only one planet Earth, in that we are part of the same system, the ones that have known and understood and lived accordingly have been Indigenous peoples worldwide. They are, in my opinion, Indigenous peoples are key to rebuilding the relationship with nature, to reconciling with nature. In our current times of multiple interconnected crises of food, energy, finance, I think that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science and wisdom should be considered a critical asset. And I would focus on perhaps a more specific topic here, basically looking at the role of Indigenous women in particular. We know that there are more than close to 180 million Indigenous peoples worldwide. Half of them are women, no? And even though considering the global population, Indigenous peoples are the 6%, they make up for the 19% of the extremely poor. And if you look at the numbers with Indigenous women in terms of access to education, to health services, regarding ownership over their lands and territories, we see the arithmetic really going down. The transactional inequalities that affect Indigenous women, I think, are a major obstacle for them to exercise their full rights, but also to contribute as they have the right to the main solutions, not only to improve their own quality of life, to guarantee their livelihoods, but to contribute to the society as a whole, as political actors. And I'm not speaking only about, conventional politics, but, exercising, doing politics, even from the margins, and having their voices heard. I remember when I have been a lead negotiator on climate for more than a decade, and we I was able to support the establishment of this Indigenous Knowledge Platform under the umbrella of the UN Convention on Climate Change. And I have seen the agency of Indigenous peoples leaders, Indigenous women, during the negotiations of the Paris Agreement, of all the agreements on climate during the 26 COPs. They have been present, they have had a voice, they have contributed to the climate discussion. And now I think that in return, we need some things to happen. Number one, that the resources and the funding reach Indigenous communities, that the Green Climate Fund, but all the financial mechanisms that are connected to climate really invest in nature-based solutions, really invest in improving the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples, really invest to guarantee that the property and ownership of their lands and territories is a requisite for them to ensure that they can control and decide over their resources. And we see, if you look at the drought in the Horn of Africa, if you look at what is happening with the Amazon, and I heard the previous speaker, he's so right. I have the privilege to serve in the advisory board of the Science Panel for the Amazon. The situation of the Amazonian region, not only in Brazil, but in the 8 countries that share the Amazon, is really something of concern. And the solution, we often hear circular economy, regenerative economies, and yes, I think that they provide, it's a new economic paradigm, but it is a paradigm that has been the practice for centuries among Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. So just to close, to say that this conversation connecting Indigenous rights, particularly Indigenous women's rights, access to finance and resources, ownership over their lands and territories, really makes sense if we want to stabilize our climate. And we see in general, in terms of climate finance, we have a little above 7% investment in adaptation and resilience building, and most of the package of the resources is going to mitigation. We need to rebalance the money, but rebalance also, the destination of the resources. I really hope that the Green Climate Fund adapts better to the needs of Indigenous peoples. I also hope that the philanthropic sector, civil society, intermediary organizations, and public money go directly to improve the quality of life of Indigenous peoples, to guarantee their lives, their rights, both individual and collective, and to allow them the space to contribute even more meaningfully, to stabilize climate. So there is an interconnectedness, a very tight relationship between rights, resources, and nature-based solutions for climate. So thank you very much for this. Thank you for organizing this dialogue, which I think is very much needed, and it can be part of the solution. Thank you so much, and back to you, Salima.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maria, for the wonderful remarks, and also for really being a co-organizer. You've been with us on this journey to now we are here today. You've really supported, contributed. I'd like some of the things that I just want to bring out that you mentioned. For us in the Global South, it's really about adaptation and resilience. As much as the Global North needs mitigation, but we need to balance the finances the way Maria has said. We need to balance them so that at least for adaptation and for resilience in the Global South, we have enough finances to for those areas of work. She mentioned something that is really interesting. Climate change is a symptom of a broken relationship between humans and nature. That's what it is. I think it boils down to that. One time a friend told me, humans are destroying the earth. You destroy the earth, humans will be phased out, the earth will flourish, the flowers will come up, the rivers will flow, but who will be the loser? It is the human race, because we will be wiped out completely from this, from Mother Earth. So that relationship, as she says, we need to re-establish the relationship between humans and also and with Mother Earth, and that is really critical to know. Of course, the role of women is critical. We cannot talk about this. We cannot have this conversation without the role of Indigenous women in this, because they are the custodians of our knowledge, custodians of our traditions. We heard yesterday or yesterday about them, the medicines that they have, the way they conserve our environment. So thank you so much for those remarks. So I will now move on to the next speaker, and that will be our colleague from USAID to give some open remarks, if it is possible, if she's online already. I'm told she was already online, Miss Gillian Caldwell. She's online, yes. Thank you so much. And
Yes.
I just wanted to recognize the other colleagues from USAID who are here present with us. We have Vim and we have Sandra. Please let the audience see you. These are very close relations for us within the Indigenous Foundation. So I now welcome Ms. Gillian Caldwell to give some opening remarks on behalf of USAID.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I just tweeted some of Maria Fernanda Espinosa's remarks, especially about how climate change is really a tragic call for a reconciliation between human beings and nature, and Indigenous communities have such a critical role in helping us advance that reconciliation. And we in turn at USAID have a critically important role in supporting Indigenous people. I recognize, and we recognize, the absolutely essential role Indigenous people play in our fight against climate change. And I know that from my own many years of experience fighting for climate justice in previous roles. You will be aware, I think, that Indigenous people are really global leaders in sustainable environmental preservation, and that a quarter of the world's above ground carbon is stored in tropical forests on land governed and inhabited by Indigenous people. And on lands Indigenous people and local communities legally controlled, deforestation rates are lower, and the amount of stored carbon is higher than on neighboring lands and forests. And this is so important because if deforestation were a country, it would be the world's third largest emitter, behind only China and yours truly, the United States of America. So there are just so many lessons we need to learn from Indigenous communities about stewardship and reconciliation. And Maria Espinosa also referred to the critical role that Indigenous women play in the preservation of Indigenous knowledge and practice. For example, Indigenous people are really often on the front lines of the worst effect of climate change. I mean, not only are they living in geographic regions that are highly vulnerable, but because of this intimate connection to nature, which is so central to their livelihoods and culture and way of life, they're especially susceptible to and attuned to the effects of variations in climate. I remember hearing, as I met at the last COP in Glasgow, from Indigenous community members, that they have their own early warning systems when it comes to the climate crisis, and that Indigenous communities have been aware long before the IPCC scientists had to tell them that our climate was changing in very dangerous ways. And yet Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous women, have been marginalized from key decision-making processes, from climate program design and funding opportunities. They're always the last to get the resources, is the truth when it comes to Indigenous communities. And then there's this issue of the trend of criminalization and violence against environmental defenders, which is so sickening and dangerous. I mean, between 2002 and 2022, the organization I used to run, Global Witness, documented more than 2,100 killings of land and environmental defenders. And that's surely an underestimate. I know that because of their very stringent methodology. They had to connect those killings to their work on land and environmental defense. And that's a high burden of proof. So we know that's a vast underestimate. But my point is that a majority of those defenders who are being killed are Indigenous people. They represent a disproportionate majority of the people being killed for standing up for their lives and livelihoods. So, you know, at USAID, we're very committed to improving, and we do need to improve the way we engage, support, and partner with Indigenous people on climate programs. We have, you know, an actual policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous people, which lays out clear operating principles in the areas of identifying, analyzing, engaging, safeguarding, and partnering with Indigenous people. And importantly, we launched our very ambitious climate strategy on Earth Day, April 22nd of this year. And that will guide our work through 2030 and calls for a whole of agency response to the climate crisis. You know, we have an aim to collectively, across the agency, every bureau, mission, and operating unit contributing, reduce our carbon emissions by 6 billion tons, protect 100 million hectares of carbon critical landscape, much of which is land where Indigenous people are living, and catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance. But focusing on building partnerships with Indigenous people and supporting Indigenous leadership in climate action is an explicit and important part of the strategic framework in that strategy. And I suspect many of you here today were a part of providing feedback to ensure that we had the strongest possible climate strategy, and we're deeply grateful for, you know, for that feedback. So, you know, the strategy really highlights our commitment to co-creating decision-making opportunities, documenting and applying Indigenous knowledge, funding Indigenous people, securing Indigenous land rights, and ensuring that whenever we are supposed to, which hopefully is a vast majority of the circumstances. I know there's a lot of legal debate about this question, but free, prior, and informed consent. And every single word of that phrase is important: free, prior, and informed. And I know there's a history, you know, where, especially where creating new preserves and concerns about the new 30 by 30 initiative, that Indigenous people will once again be shunted off the land that they live on. And I think it's so important that we stand up and alongside Indigenous communities. So in terms of how donors can better integrate the perspectives of Indigenous people in programs, I just wanted to highlight a couple of examples of work we've done recently. The Indigenous Peoples Alliance for Rights and Development, or IPARD, which I think Susan may already have presented, I'm not certain, is a great example. That's a $20 million public-private partnership, which is jointly funded by USAID and the Forest Stewardship Council. It was co-created by USAID, FSC, and the FSC Indigenous Foundations, and FSC's Permanent Indigenous Peoples Community. So that was a year-long co-creation process, which Susan participated in, and he really continues to guide the implementation of that program. And you know, importantly, IPARD, that's our USAID's policy on Indigenous people, is guided by the Indigenous Program Management approach, whereby global, regional, and local Indigenous leaders are contributing to the design, direction, planning, and implementation of the program. I know there's other panelists here today, you know, whether it's Sena or Sanchez, that have been very involved. With respect to, I think I'm probably running out of time, but just a few more things. With respect to Indigenous women and girls, FSC's Indigenous Foundation is implementing the Indigenous Women and Girls Economic Empowerment Initiative, which is really aiming to promote the economic empowerment of Indigenous women and girls. And, you know, for those who are champions of Indigenous people's rights and environmental protection, it's important to note that women and girls face this disproportionate risk of gender-based violence for their activism. So we have an important program called RISE, standing for Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable Environments, which supports UTSCHE, a local Indigenous organization in Guatemala, with funding to implement gender-based violence workshops to really influence the work to protect community forests. Yeah, I think, am I at time? I do have more to say, but I don't want to take up all the time on this panel. I am very grateful to be here. How are we doing on time?
Thank you very much. And you are still, so don't go away. You are still in another panel. So those who are just opening remarks. Thank you so much, but we are in another panel.
Okay. Okay. I think I might have gotten confused then, but I'm here.
Yes, no, thank you, but you're on track.
Okay.
The next conversation you are in. So thank you very much, but I really appreciate those remarks. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that USAID is a very generous donor, not only to the Indigenous Foundation, but I think to most organizations in the Global South. They have a very strong affiliation with Indigenous peoples. And you've heard from the speaker about the strategy that they are developing currently that is really focusing a lot on Indigenous peoples. So there is a lot that is happening. The support that we're getting from USAID is very, very huge in terms of supporting us to support the Indigenous people to at least conserve nature and conserve Mother Earth. She's also talked about women, the way Maria Fernanda talked about women as well, as you know, they are very critical in this conversation. If we don't bring them to the table, then it is difficult for us to even talk about climate change without the women voices coming in. And the last thing that she talked about also that I think is worth mentioning is the rights defenders, the Indigenous people's rights defenders, the ones that are getting killed on in a daily basis. And it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. They are Indigenous people being killed because they stand for the rights of their territories. And that really needs to be looked into, needs to be addressed, and our governments need to take their, play their role clearly. So thank you for that, and we will come back to the next session. So I think we are done with the opening remarks from our leaders. So we're moving now into the conversation. The conversation is divided into 3 panels. The first panel will be speaking to Indigenous voices, challenges and opportunities. And then we'll go into the second one. Second panel will be looking at donor perspectives, investing in the fight against climate change. And I think we'll bring up our colleague again from USAID to talk to us a little more about that. And then we'll have the third panel, which is Indigenous-led initiatives, nature-based solutions. So I'm going to introduce the speakers as we move along. So for the first panel, which is Indigenous Voices, Challenges and Opportunities, we have Umaru Aisetu, who is the Vice President of Repaliek, working in central part of Africa. And she brings also a lot of experience to the table in terms of the work that Repaliek is doing in the Congo Basin, in the 11 countries that make up the Congo Basin in Central Africa. And then we have Dr. Kanyike Sena, who will be speaking to us from online. Dr. Sena is the director of the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, IPAC, and he'll be speaking to us from Nairobi. He also brings a lot of experience being Indigenous leader himself from the Okie community. Also to mention that Aisetu is also from the Indigenous community. She's from the Mbororo Fulani, based in Chad. Dr. Sena is from Kenya. Then we have Mina Setra, who will be speaking to us much later. She's the Deputy to Secretary General of AMAN, the Archipelago Indigenous Peoples Alliance. So just want to say that each speaker really are giving very, very strict timeline, 7 minutes if we can, so that we can also give the audience the chance to engage us after the conversations. So without much ado, I'm inviting Ms. Aisetu Umaru to take her 7 minutes and talk to us about the work that Repaliek is doing.
Alors, j'invite Umaru Aisetu de Repaliek.
Merci beaucoup, Selina. Bonjour tout le monde. Moi, je suis Aïssa Toumaro Ibrahim. Je suis la coordinatrice adjointe de l'association des femmes, Peuls et peuples autochtones du Tchad. Et puis, je suis la coordinatrice adjointe du réseau des peuples autochtones et des communautés locales d'Afrique centrale, le REPALEAC.
Buenos días. Could you please hold for the translation? Thank you. My name is Oumarou Aissatu. I come from the coordinating committee in Chad and for the REPALEAC.
Je tiens à remercier particulièrement FSC d'avoir permis mon arrivée dans ce pays pour assister à ces instances. Alors, le REPALEAC, c'est un réseau sous-régional de communautés autochtones et peuples autochtones et communautés locales qui est né en 2003 à Kigali avec l'aide du CEFDAC et de la COMIFAC.
Okay, so I would like to thank FSC for giving me this opportunity to be here. REPALEAC is a regional network and is also that was created in 2003 in Kigali and helps local communities and indigenous communities as well.
Le REPALEAC couvre 8 pays d'Afrique centrale, à savoir le Burundi, le Cameroun, le Congo, le Gabon, le RCA, la RDC et le Tchad. Donc, nous avons 8 pays en Afrique centrale et le REPALEAC couvre plus de 467 organisations de base.
REPALEAC covers 8 countries in Central Africa: Burundi, Cameroon, Congo, Gabon, RFI, and Chad, plus 467 organizations.
REPALEAC a développé une stratégie durable de peuples autochtones et communautés locales dans le cadre de la protection de l'environnement, des droits généraux, y compris l'accès à la terre, aux services élémentaires de base.
We are working on an environmental strategy to work for the land and for food security.
Notre vision est d'avoir une Afrique unie, valorisée, et qui conserve durablement la nature avec la contribution et la participation des peuples autochtones et communautés locales, et pour mission de mener un plaidoyer pour la participation et la prise en compte des droits et intérêts des peuples autochtones et communautés locales dans les sphères de la négociation.
Our vision is to have Africa be able to give her contribution with the indigenous communities and local communities and to request their participation in the decision making.
Alors, comme toute autre organisation, nous sommes confrontés à des défis, bien qu'il y a des opportunités. Alors, les défis qui nous touchent les plus, c'est déjà l'ignorance de notre existence, même dans la plupart des pays de la sous-région.
As an organization, we face many challenges and many opportunities. Our main challenge is for our community, our existence, and the participation of our communities.
Ces défis-là, qui sont entre autres, il y a l'ignorance de notre existence, mais aussi l'accès aux finances. nous n'avons pas la possibilité d'accéder aux finances puisque je prends le cas de ma propre communauté, il y a moins de 0,1% des garçons qui sont allés à l'école. Les filles, c'est quasiment nul pratiquement.
Okay, these challenges are based on our existence and access to finance. I give you the example of Morocco, where less than 1% of the population goes to school.
Mais cela n'est pas vraiment une grande barrière parce que nous sommes là pour pouvoir aller vers les partenaires, vous exposer les projets, le problème de la communauté qui vivent et qui n'arrivent pas à extraire ce qu'ils ont parce qu'il y a une barrière de communication. Déjà, si vous remarquez ici, je suis la seule à parler le français et j'ai du mal à comprendre ce qui se fait. Voilà, ça c'est une barrière. Et les partenaires ont du mal à travailler avec l'Afrique centrale.
But this is not a barrier because that's why we are here. We can go to our associates and tell them what is happening, but we can see a huge barrier for communication. As you see me here, I'm the only French speaker, and I have difficulty understanding as well what you are saying, but we have to overcome this barrier in Central Africa for communication.
Alors, je m'en vais vous donner un exemple qui peut aussi aider les partenaires à aller vers ces communautés. Ce n'est pas parce qu'on ne parle pas votre langue, on ne suit pas vos lignes directrices, on n'arrive pas à remplir vos formulaires que nous ne sommes pas capables à mener des actions réelles dans le cadre de protection de l'environnement et de la biodiversité dans notre environnement.
For example, it is the help that we need for the associates to go to these places and see what is the real problem. It's not the language that gives us the real problem to fill the forms that we have to submit in order to participate in these actions.
En 2012, nous avons eu une activité dans le cadre de protection des droits des peuples autochtones dans un village à 200 km de la ville principale de mon pays, qui est le N'Djamena.
In 2012, we had an activity for the protection of the environment, and it took place in Kiruyamena, 200 kilometers from the capital.
Et parmi les présentateurs, il y a quelqu'un qui a discuté avec les femmes et il a fait sortir un équivalent de moins de $20. Et il les a donnés pour réaliser une activité génératrice de revenus. Et ma coordinatrice en a ajouté environ $80, ce qui va autour de $100 d'entretemps pour réaliser une petite activité dans la communauté.
And the presenter was someone who was interested in talking to women, and he just gave the equivalent of $1, and then we were able to raise around $80, and we were able to carry out all this activity with only $100.
Ces femmes-là ont utilisé cet argent en achetant un sac d'arachide. Elles se sont organisées à le partager à 4 ou à 5 femmes qui vont utiliser pendant 3 semaines et reverser un équivalent de $0,1 par semaine dans la caisse.
These women used the money to buy food and they shared it between them, and it was enough for them. It lasted for 3 weeks, and it was only the equivalent of $1 each.
À la fin de 3 semaines, elles restituent la quantité qu'elles ont prise pour que d'autres femmes puissent réutiliser. Et à nos jours, les femmes ont plus d'un magasin plus grand que cette salle-là, remplie d'arachides. Elles ont de l'argent, elles envoient leurs enfants à l'école et elles sont autonomes elles-mêmes.
After the 3 weeks, they had to give back to other women these equivalents of $1, and they multiplied the product that they acquired in the first time. So they gave it back and to others, and now they have a huge store with the produce of these things that they commercialized, and now they have money to send their kids to school and also to be economically independent.
Je voudrais vous dire à travers ça que c'est pas qu'il va falloir remplir les formulaires compliqués pour pouvoir changer notre environnement. Donc, il nous faut seulement un coup de pouce pour pouvoir réaliser, parce que nous disposons des savoirs traditionnels autochtones.
Through this example, what I want to tell you is that we do not need to fill complicated forms to change our way of life. We just need some help to start because we have the knowledge and we know how to do it.
Et que nous souhaitons à ce que les partenaires puissent travailler directement avec les organisations concernées que de passer par des milliers de chemins, puisqu'on a eu à comprendre dernièrement que moins de 1% des fonds dédiés au peuple autochtone qui arrivent directement chez les communautés concernées.
We want to tell the associates that they should try working with the organizations directly. They do not have to go through too many people, and the money has to arrive directly to the indigenous communities.
Alors, je crois que j'ai dépassé mes 7 minutes, mais je suis là à répondre aux questions. Merci.
I think I went over 7 minutes, but I'll be here if you need, if you have any questions. Thank you.
Merci. Merci bien, Icca. Je pense que tu as élevé vraiment des points que nos bailleurs doivent apprécier. I'm just saying to her that I think she raised some points that our donors would also appreciate. That is not always about filling out complicated papers. I worked on a project last year for a Green Climate Fund, and those papers are complicated. Nobody can fill those papers out. And if you really expect rural women to develop bankable proposals and fill out those papers, that money will never reach them. So it is really good to know that she's saying, if we don't speak your language, we don't have the literacy level to fill out your formulas. It doesn't mean that we're coming to the table with a clean slate. We are coming with knowledge. We're coming with traditions. It is a partnership. That's what it is. I bring the knowledge, you bring the money, and we're in business. I think that's the message you're saying. I don't want to miss it, to put words in her mouth, but I think that those are the things that she was going to emphasize. And she has also demonstrated just very little money can go a long way. They just need a push, and they can go a long way in changing their own communities. And thank you very much for those remarks. Now, let me call Dr. Kanyike Sena, Director of IPAC, and he'll be speaking to us from Nairobi. Nairobi is already online. Karibu sana, Daktari.
Thank you so much, Selina. for organizing this, FSC generally, for organizing this very important discussion. I'm trying to switch on my video, but it says the host has rejected. So I don't know whether you would like to see my face or not. But I'm actually in my rural village in Kenya, a village called Narok, not far from the Masai Mara. So just to add on what the introduction, I work with an organization called the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, which is a network of about 135 indigenous peoples organizations in 22 countries in Africa. Our secretariat is in Cape Town, but I'm based in Nairobi. No, in Narok, I mean. So challenges and opportunities that indigenous peoples face in Africa are plenty. And I'll just take this opportunity to discuss a few. And I'd like to state on the onset that I'm not really an expert on this field, but I'll say a few things. So as has been said, climate change is real and is impacting our communities in very difficult and disastrous ways. The lady from USAID referred to the current drought in northern Kenya, which is devastating community livelihoods and cultures, and actually contributing to extensive violence, intercommunal violence in that area. So as Selina says, for us, though the donor world is more interested in mitigation, for us in Africa, adaptation is a priority. And I would like also to say that this is what the African group of negotiators are also emphasizing. And indigenous people are also emphasizing that we need adaptation. So we really appreciate that indigenous peoples have really been included at very high levels in climate change negotiations. And we can see this right from the preamble of the Paris Agreement, the establishment of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And of course, we see mobilization of funding towards indigenous communities, though there's that big debate that the money should now be going directly to the communities. Okay. I would like to say that Africa faces a big challenge because even that fraction of funding that goes directly to indigenous communities globally, I think there's a study by RRI and on that, very few of that reaches Africa for a number of reasons. First of all, as has been said, the application process is very, very complicated. And most indigenous organizations in Africa don't have that capacity to meet those conditions that are required. Secondly, donor priorities tend to be different from indigenous people's priorities. And this is a main challenge. And of course, indigenous peoples sometimes are not even aware that there is this funding available for them to execute some of these climate change strategies that they're implementing in their villages. So some of these discussions too around climate change, mitigation, climate change adaptation, take too long that they become very tiresome. Instead of just discussing the frameworks and then learning by doing, there's a focus on perfection. Let's design this, let's design safeguards, let's design this and this. So, and that actually tends to tire communities. They raise expectations of communities for a while, but at the same time, the time in which the discussion tire out communities. One example I can give you is the Red Plus discussion that has been going on since I don't know which year, and communities have been expecting that they'll get some funding for forest management practices, but that has really remained elusive because of too much attention to detail, sometimes which is very minor. However, there are very interesting projects that are also developing towards addressing indigenous people's climate change. The few, I've seen some in northern Kenya that work around soil carbon. I've seen a forest project in Tanzania that supports the Hadzabe, do their carbon. But unfortunately, we are not harvesting experiences for these few projects to inform the larger processes. So indigenous peoples, even from other areas, are not even aware that these projects are going on, and some of them involve significant amount of funding. For example, the Northern Kenya project, a few months ago, the communities received about $5 million for soil carbon through improved livestock management practices. But other communities generally are not even aware of this. So there's that need to share among communities the different strategies and some of the things that they're doing. Ease of access to financing is a key. And of course, the whole idea of strengthening the capacity, building capacity of indigenous peoples, not only to negotiate, but also to take leadership in the design and implementation of the projects around climate change. What we are seeing from the few projects that I've described is that there are a lot of intermediaries there, and obviously the percentage that will eventually reach the communities and bring meaningful change is quite little compared to the overall funding that may have gone to a particular project. So there's a need to raise awareness of indigenous peoples about available funding opportunities, to build their capacities to be able to design and implement these projects by themselves, and of course, build strong monetary systems. But there's also a need also to invest in strengthening community structures, because as a result of historical marginalization, many of indigenous peoples in Africa, their systems are either collapsed or in the process of collapsing. So there's need to build that capacity. And of course, the whole aspect of livelihoods is quite important. And a number of speakers have already spoken about that, because without livelihoods, strengthening livelihoods, communities themselves become a threat to some of their rights. Because when you look at what is happening in some areas, communities even tend to sell land in order to eat, you know. But if we have strong livelihood systems, then they'll be able to protect and conserve their lands. But besides livelihood, we need also to strengthen indigenous economies around these nature-based solutions. Because like now, I'm very much interested to see how the communities that have received some of this carbon money and what are their priorities. But when you look at what they are prioritizing to do, they are focusing on things like building schools, maybe a hospital and a water project, but they're not discussing ways of utilizing those finances to reinvest and strengthen their economies. So to me, this becomes very important. And I've also heard some talk about FPIC. FPIC remains a very big issue. But when you look at all climate finance projects in Africa, they'll have utilized some certain standards. Maybe some will have utilized the FSC standards, some would have utilized the RED plus social and environmental standards, among others. And you'll hear the implementers of the project talk about FPIC of indigenous peoples. But when you go talking to communities, you'll realize that there are issues about how FPIC was done and whether that really constituted FPIC and what is actually even FPIC in the first place in the African context. So we need to learn, we need to exchange visits, we need to capacity building, we need to deepen this discussion further. And of course, we need the global community to prioritize Africa, because as it stands now, Africa generally as a continent and indigenous peoples in Africa have been left behind in everything. And this is contrary to what governments have committed within the Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you so much. I've seen that I've gone 3 minutes beyond time. Forgive me for that, Selina. Asante.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daktari, for speaking to us from Kenya. And I think you raised some really critical issues. What is happening in the Horn of Africa today, the conflicts that we see in the Horn of Africa, let's put it very clearly, they are climate change prone. They are caused by climate change, nothing else. We've established that. Studies are coming out. There are groups that are formed in the Horn of Africa doing studies around that. And it really points out to climate change. And I think Hindu told us the other day, if we do not take care of this, what is going on in the savannah, you will start seeing camels in forests. And yet camels never belong in forests. Why? It's because climate change will have destroyed the pasture that these camels need, and they have to move elsewhere. And this is happening in the Horn of Africa. You find cattle rearers driving their animals right into people's farms to eat up crops, because there's nothing else that they can do. So I think that is a very good, important point that we look at. You've also emphasized the funding, which I think we are all saying actually funding is not a problem. Funding, money is there. It is the processes. How does it come to the people? What mechanisms do we need to put in place, especially in indigenous communities where you're saying that structures are broken down. So there are no structures that can support maybe this type of funding, and we need to look at the mechanisms we need to put in place. Also talked about building strong livelihood systems and economies around nature-based solutions in indigenous communities, and also the issue of FPIC, which is not well understood. It needs to be unpacked, especially in the context of Africa. What does it really mean? How does it work? How, because when you go around to communities, you don't know how it was done, whether even the communities understood. They gave consent like that without really understanding even on what FPIC is all about. So thank you for those few remarks. We'll now move to the second panel. I'm trying to be very concise with time, but before I do that, let me recognize the presence of my two colleagues who are in the room with us that have been supporting us as well. We have Dr. Alejandro Paredes, who is also a colleague from the FSC Indigenous Foundation, director of the IFAD program, so that the people can see you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then Mr. Carlos Blandon, who is also our program lead, political incidents and social participation. So these are the colleagues we are here together. Some are online that we are not able to see at this time. So our second panel is about donor perspectives, investing in the fight against climate change. And here we have Andrea Johnson, advisor, Global Mexico and America Initiatives for GWL. Okay, and then we have again Gillian Caldwell from USAID. She'll just make a few remarks, but really focusing towards the topic, which is investing in the fight against climate change. And then Yoko Watanabe, who is the global manager of GEF Small Grants Program at UNDP, right? Thank you very much. So these are the people that are going to talk to us, and each one of you has 7 minutes. Let me start with Andrea Johnson to talk to us about investing in the fight against climate change.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you all here today. I'm going to do that millennial thing of talking from notes on the phone. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Climate and Land Use Alliance, CLUA is an alliance of 6 foundations, all from the global north. It's the Ford Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Packard Foundation, Climate Works Foundation, Good Energies, and Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. And historically it was an alliance created in 2009 to align strategies around land use, climate, forests. And over the last decade has been, I think, a relevant and important force for aligning and increasing this discourse around the importance of Indigenous lands and rights as part of the climate solutions within global narratives. But we have a lot of work to do. We are historically an alliance of northern foundations that give out large amounts of money to primarily large northern NGOs, and we're trying to change that. We're trying to shift and get better at giving differently. 4 of CLUA's 6 member foundations now are part of the Glasgow pledge around land tenure security for Indigenous people and local communities. I'm not sure if that came up at the beginning, but that was a pledge made by donors at the Glasgow climate negotiations, $1.7 billion in support of greater tenure security and related work. And as an alliance and as individual member foundations, CLUA is actively engaged within that process, as well as within our own alliance, and trying to figure out how to shift both the amounts of funding that are going to the Global South and directly to Indigenous organizations, and also the ways in which that money is channeled, the mechanisms with which it's deployed, and how it's reported on and used. I wanted to bring up a study that just came out this week, in fact, by the Rainforest Foundation Norway, which I think speaks to the question of how can we know that we need to get more money to the Global South and directly to Indigenous organizations, local community organizations, but how do we actually do that? That's the question that you posed me. And I think there are very concrete recommendations, and there are real issues that we need to talk through. This Rainforest Foundation study called Fit for Purpose, which was just launched this week by, it was RFN and also the Rights and Resources Initiative, did an assessment of the money that goes within the climate and land use and forest space that goes directly to Indigenous organizations, and found that, first of all, less than 2%, about 1%, right, annually of money for climate, land use, and forests actually goes in any way, shape, or form to issues related to Indigenous people. So it's ridiculous. And then even within that 1%, that $270 million that does go to things related to Indigenous land rights, tenure, security, and related issues, only 17%, according to this analysis, actually goes to activities that specifically name an Indigenous organization in the project, in the proposal. So a lot of the money that in theory is even going to projects and initiatives related to Indigenous land tenure is actually going to large NGOs and organizations that are naming, that are maybe nominally working with an Indigenous organization. So we need to change that. We need to do better. I think that some of the lessons that we hear and that come across loud and clear in the work that we're we're doing with partners from the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, which includes Repaleac, Aman, and Koika, Amepebe, Gustavo, and who am I missing there? Abibe, Koika, Repaleac, Aman.
Son 5. AMPB.
Yeah, son 5. Anyway, some of the key lessons that are coming across. A is rights-based approaches. Begin with rights. Secondly, we need to do funding that's longer term. It's more systemic funding rather than strategic funding. It's not one-year proposals. It's a 5-year proposal that is focused on a core support, not these are the 5 pillars of action that you need to report against. And a lot of our member foundations are really thinking through how to do better at general operating support, learning from colleagues like Global Green Grants and others. Another one that I love this phrase from Mina, who's not here yet, but we need to shift from receipts-based reporting to results-based reporting. So instead of thinking about, instead of being totally focused on where did every dollar go and do you have the paperwork to show for it, let's look at the results on the ground. Let's actually look at the communities and the forests that community well-being, and let's make that actually the metric of success for a proposal and of accountability. And then 2 other things I wanted to say. I think another key lesson is that there has to be a sustained dialogue between Indigenous organizations and donors that is about what are the obstacles and how can we change that? Where are there like legitimate obstacles that might be questions of law, of compliance related to public taxpayer money, versus obstacles that are more just status quo mindset of Northern foundations or public money. So I think that that dialogue is actually really important, and that is something that just yesterday, we saw. Yesterday, there was a dialogue between the members of this IPLC pledge from Glasgow with the Global Alliance organizations. And those are the kind of things that need to happen more and more, really to land that understanding. And then finally, I think, and this is where foundations and private philanthropy, I think, can play a particularly valuable role, because we are more flexible and we have the ability to change procedures more quickly than perhaps some public money does, is to really invest in building the overall sort of plumbing or architecture of financial flows, building the mechanisms and funds that are hosted, for example, like the Mesoamerican Territorial Fund or Aman's new Nusantara Fund, building and seeding and supporting the structures that will allow money to flow more successfully to Southern organizations. I'm probably at 7 minutes. Okay. Can I just say one more thing? Okay, just to put a provocation out there. I do think that as we're talking about all of this, it's important for us as funders also to acknowledge that money is not the end goal. Money is a tool for well-being and for political power. And money can divide movements, and money can be a problem if it's not handled well. And this is not about Indigenous people and local communities. Every social movement in history has wrestled with what happens when you have an influx of resources. It can divide as much as it can support. And so I think that us also as funders, we have a responsibility to be in a really equal relationship with our partners and to talk about, ask those hard questions about accountability to your movements, to your organization, to your member organizations, and how you're going to, as these resources do increase, how are we going to do it in a way that actually strengthens these political movements and results in buen vivir, that results in good results on the ground rather than creating more problems.
Thank you so much. You are part of the Glasgow Pledge.
Most of our member foundations, yes.
Are part of that. And please, you'll tell us where the money is, right?
Yeah.
We're still waiting. I was in Glasgow and I listened to it. So I'm still waiting to hear where it is. Yeah?
I think a lot of people are,
yeah, I think that is what thank you so much. And looking at the recommendations of the study are quite interesting. Is that something that you can share after maybe with most of the partners so that they can go through the recommendations are quite really useful. Systemic funding versus strategic funding. I think that those are things that we need to look at. Receipts based versus results based. Okay, we give receipts, which is really important because it's part of accountability. But I think we need to go beyond that and look at the results and say what impact did that money make. And then the dialogue is absolutely critical. And there are donors that do that. They really hold dialogues every week, but there are donors that don't. So I think we've got to be consistent when it comes to dialogue with the people that work. And of course, the last point that you made is really very powerful, that the money is a tool, yeah? It's not there to destroy, but I think it's there to build the relationship between the funders and the recipients. I think it should be like that. Thank you very much. So let me move now to Gillian Caldwell. She said she will just need a few minutes to add on what she started earlier on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been listening carefully, and I too am sorry not to be with you there in person. Just a few reflections really on what I've heard, because I said a lot earlier. So first, this comment that the money is there, that's not the challenge. What are the processes and mechanisms? Yes, the money is there, but is it there for Indigenous communities, right? And to your point about the Glasgow Pledge, I know because I heard from my team that they're currently in the process of really trying to calculate alongside the other donors to that pledge where things stand for a report at COP. And I think that's, that accountability and transparency so that we move beyond promises to action is absolutely critical. But to the point about processes and mechanisms, also so important, for a big donor, and many of the government-based donors like USAID really struggle with this process of so-called localization, or how we move from what has become a standard process of investing in much larger internationally based organizations that may have a presence in country instead of the local organizations themselves. We have a strong emphasis on localization at USAID. It's something Raj Shah talked about in his tenure leadership. Still haven't made as much progress as we should, and our administrator Samantha Powers really emphasized that. Speaking in terms of getting transparency to these processes, we launched a website which is continuing to, I think, improve. It's called workwithusaid.org. And it's intended to demystify, the process of working with us and to create a more open door so that people can understand how to advance that work. I think the point about the fact that Indigenous communities also often, not just Indigenous communities, but people seeking philanthropic funding more generally often have different priorities. And, that leads me to this conversation about trust-based philanthropy. Might be weird to be hearing, somebody at USAID talking about that. I know it's not our specialty, but I think we do need to increase our trust in partners and partnership and find ways to create more flexibility and adaptability. We can still have outcomes-oriented grant making that isn't bean counting, that's really focused on driving real impact in the world and on a relationship based in understanding and co-creation. I think another problem, when it comes to investing locally in Indigenous communities, and it's something I worry about a lot, is what we don't want is to have everybody reinvent themselves to function like the rest of, the NGO industrial complex, as it were. Sometimes community-based organizations, or often community-based organizations, are as effective as they are precisely because they do things differently. They haven't built up this sort of massive infrastructure. They're dispersed, they're leader-full, with empowered leadership dispersed throughout communities. So I just wonder if we need new models, for maybe locally based entities that do more than function as a fiscal sponsor, but that provide some of that front office support to allow Indigenous communities and community-based organizations to do what they do best without having to deal with the machinery that will continue to be necessary to some extent for large government donors, because we're heavily scrutinized. We need to sustain congressional support. We need to have a lot of accountability for the dollars, which I understand. Couldn't agree more on the Green Climate Fund. The U.S. is actually going to be a co-chair of the fund starting in the new year, and they're starting the search for a new executive director. In fact, because Yannick is not going to re-up his term when it ends, so there's going to be changes at the Green Climate Fund, and I think they are, I believe, starting to absorb the feedback, which has been voluminous, on the time it takes to get accredited and the challenges to get the funding. And USAID is really working closely to try to both support our in-country allies and partners to access that funding, and to identify more locally based entities that warrant the support. I guess the last thing I would just say is, we can't continue to rely exclusively on the philanthropic sector or even the public sector for the support we need to get where we're going. And I've been thinking a lot about these voluntary carbon markets, and I mean they're so complicated, and they're so concerning on some level, right? And I know there's a lot of concern within Indigenous communities about these, just the commercialization of nature, even as a principle. But I'm of the mindset that, they are here to stay. There is going to be, in Africa alone, for example, a projected growth in the size of the voluntary carbon market from, I think 1 billion, if I'm not mistaken, in 2021 to 50 billion in 2030. And the real question is, how much transparency is there going to be in those markets, many of which are going to be supporting nature-based solutions to carbon sequestration, which is where Indigenous communities play such an important role, as I said earlier. What's the transparency going to look like? And how can we ensure equity in those markets so that it's not just the developers of these projects, and how can we ensure there's actual integrity? It's additional, because we can't offset our way out of this crisis. We need decarbonization first. So I just think it's a mistake not to engage on this issue and to push for the transparency and the equity we need to ensure that communities are supported for the stewardship they're providing, and that it is an alternative livelihood to deforestation or to other agricultural uses, which will diminish the carbon sequestration potential of the natural landscape. I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that this really goes to complement the earlier remarks that you had made regarding this. I like the idea of the commercialization of nature, which really, I think that needs quite a discussion, because it brings into questions of transparency, as you said. How will it even look like? It's good to know how and the integrity of all that needs to be looked into. And I think you are agreeing with me seriously that the funding is there, yeah? That the funding is there, that we need to put in place mechanisms that can support the processes of supporting organizations to access this money. And we look forward to USAID being the co-chair, if I understood, of the GCF. Maybe that will unblock a lot of things at the Green Climate Fund.
Sorry, just to correct, we won't be the co-chair. It will be State and Treasury in the seat, but we're hoping that we're going to have a formal technical advisory role, which will better position us to serve as an intermediary to get the right locally based organizations in front of the GCF. But it will be State and Treasury that lead with the actual co-chair position. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. That was really important. So let me move to the last speaker of the group, and that is Yoko, the global manager of GEF Small Grants Program. Maybe talk to us a bit about that. What does it mean? And yeah, how do we access it?
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Selena. And it's really an honor to be here with all of you and follow Andrea and Gillian already, who have really shared a lot of experience, knowledge already. But I really am looking forward to sharing with you on this GF Small Grants Program, which is implemented by UNDP. And I think the session today, the words to action, that's exactly what we do. We really focus on actions on the ground with civil society and Indigenous peoples and local communities over 30 years. This year is our 30th anniversary. And we're really looking forward to celebrating and doing more further. So I'm just really honored to also be in a women-only panel, and then also a predominantly women roundtable here. And I really think that women's leadership is also very important in this area. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Okay, so let me, if it is possible to put it on the screen, the slides, please do so. But if it's not, it's okay too. I just thought that, for those of us who English is not our first language, it's sometimes useful to have a slide. So if it helps, just follow. So basically, I just really wanted to, next slide, please. The SGP, the Small Grants Program, was created 30 years ago under the Global Environmental Facility, which really recognized that to work on global environmental issues like climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, chemicals and waste, which all have this Rio conventions and environmental multilateral agreements, really requires local solutions. So actually the CSOs and Indigenous people fought for this window 30 years ago. And it's a major window within the GEF. Besides the government and private sector, there is a specific window called Small Grants Program to support civil society and Indigenous peoples and local communities. And we've been supporting innovative community-based initiative over the past 30 years. As you can see, we supported over 26,000 projects in 128 countries now. I have a global team of close to 200 people who are on the ground working on this and doing a decentralized financial mechanism, grant-making mechanism on the ground. The important part also is that $724 million has been invested through our program. And I will explain later, but close to 30% have gone directly to Indigenous people. So we have invested about $250 million total to Indigenous people's projects. Next slide, please. So how we operate? So we provide basically a grant up to $50,000. Our average is about $25,000 per project. But the important part is we really provide resources as a direct access to the CSOs and Indigenous peoples. And we have a very decentralized mechanism. I myself is based in New York and manage this program, but we have a national steering committee in each of the 128 countries, and they're the one who do the call for proposal and appraise the projects. And I don't get involved in any of that. Besides, I do more these type of things, as well as develop a strategy so that people are knowing about it, and also develop partnership. And not being sort of a standalone program, but we consider ourselves as a platform to reach out to the civil society and Indigenous peoples. And there's many agencies who are working under GEF, and UNDP has been partnering for the past 30 years. In the GEF 8, we're talking about expanding that partnership. So it's really trying to become really a multi-stakeholder platform. Next slide, please. So the Independent Evaluation Office of the GEF have reviewed, and over the years we have done our own assessment as well to see how our portfolio are looking like. The survey actually recognized that we are the primary modality of the GEF in reaching out to the Indigenous peoples. And the type of projects that we have been supporting is pretty wide range, from training and capacity building to really on the ground initiatives on forest conservation or climate change, renewable energy, to protected areas, to other things, and also on policy development. During the Paris Agreement, we actually convened we call it civil society and government policy dialogue, so that the voices of Indigenous peoples are reflected in the Paris Agreement of a couple of these countries. And they also went to Paris to have a direct negotiation about this issue. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, 27% of the overall SG projects is in the interest and also benefiting Indigenous peoples directly. As you know, not all the 128 countries that we work has Indigenous peoples. It's about 98 countries. And so if you focus on the 98, 37% of our projects are with Indigenous peoples. And as you can see in this side of this graph, we have done an analysis of whether those funding went directly to Indigenous groups or towards civil society organization or local communities who are working with Indigenous people. It's about half-half. We are making concerted efforts to make direct access to Indigenous people's group rather than having those intermediary. And as you can see, the blue side is more than that. And we are, that was one of the improvement points that we're really working on, and every year the direct access is increasing further. Next slide, please. So in terms of small grants programs targeted initiative, we have an Indigenous People Fellowship. Andrea here actually have worked on it for a long time, and we have been working with fellowship. I can explain about it a little bit more. There is a CSO Indigenous Peoples dialogue space, like what I mentioned about this Paris Agreement and other major global and national policy dialogue, so that we bring in the community voices. We also have a dedicated program working on Indigenous community conserved areas, as well as RED Plus programs with Indigenous people, so that their needs and opportunities are reflected in the RED Plus dialogues. We have been working with the Right Energy partnership on the energy access for Indigenous peoples. And then also there is artisanal and small scale gold mining project on the mercury impact to Indigenous peoples. So we have been really targeting some of these programs, really in having in mind the Indigenous peoples' needs and opportunities that we see. Other things is that we are really seeing that working with Indigenous youth and Indigenous women are really important elements of our work. And we've been having policy dialogue as well as targeted investment. Youth consists of about half of our portfolio, and the youth group are being the most sort of energetic and innovative ones among our portfolio. And also to facilitate access to financing, we have been talking quite a bit about how difficult it is to access financing among Indigenous people. We have a video proposal as an option. So basically, if Indigenous people wanted to propose a proposal, particularly the illiterate women and elderly people particularly can take a video saying that this is what they want to do and this is what they want to make as a result, and then we appraise that. And eventually we will have a support to make that into a written form so that we have a record in a written form as well. But this has really promoted further with Indigenous peoples to access our resources more easily. Okay. So I won't go into the details of each of the program, but the Red Plus programs, we have worked in 6 pilot projects. Next slide, please. Anyway, yeah, so 6 countries, particularly where there is tropical forest, like Panama and others. It has really facilitated developing the policies on Red Plus and also plans, and really test out the small scale initiatives on the ground. The ICCA Global Support Initiative, next slide please, is supported by the German government, which is really supporting Indigenous territories and conserved areas to be recognized as part of the protected area system. As you may know, the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, is coming up with this target under the post-2020 global biodiversity framework called 30% protected around the world. And for that, Indigenous people really will play a key role, as their territories and areas are the most biodiversity rich. And there we see a lot of opportunity by recognizing their land rights and land use rights. We will be able to protect these areas and also recognize their rights at the same time. The last initiative is the Right Energy Partnership that I mentioned. This is to promote renewable energy among the Indigenous communities. And we have been seeing a lot of, in a way, disturbance with energy access in the past with, gas pipeline going through the Indigenous lands and others. But this is to sort of go the other way around and say this is Indigenous-led sort of renewable energy promotion for their communities and using renewable energies. The last one is about the fellowship I mentioned. We have 4 global fellows that we have supported, and they have been the leaders in global forests as well as in their communities on biodiversity and climate change issue. We also have a national fellowship programs in about 10 countries where they have developed more Indigenous sound strategy so that we can really expand our program and enhance the investment on the ground. So this has been a really amazing success, and we are going to expand this to a regional level sort of fellowship program in the next round. So in a nutshell, I know I've talked quite a bit, so this is my last slide. So in summary, since this is basically discussing about what kind of different models can we bring in as donors as well as a program, how we can really develop a Indigenous peoples-led initiative. One thing that we can say from our experience is that the governance structure is really important. The decision-making process is really important. So one thing is that we have this National Steering Committee, which is predominantly majority civil society and Indigenous peoples. And I think that is really important so that the decision is sort of owned and held by the civil society and Indigenous peoples themselves. And I think that's a really key for the success of small grants as well as other mechanisms moving forward. Also, lesson sharing, of course, is really important. So we've been really investing quite a bit to share our experiences, expand that and scale up. Increased access, direct access to Indigenous people, which is what we are talking about. And in that regard, I really want to bring in maybe a few points. One is that to increase direct access, we can't think this as a short-term investment. I mean, donors' investment is usually maybe 4 or 5 years, and we see that one investment is done and it's gone. But then, for small grants program, we have been here for 30 years. And for some, Indigenous peoples group, we have been working for 30 years. And that's a process that you have to go through. You handhold, you almost like create a group, you make it legalized, you work on capacity building, you do some testing, and then finally, some of them are now working on policy at the global level, at the local level. And really, it's a process. And I really think that it's not a one-off go and we say we did something. And I think that's not something we have to learn from lessons, and the donors should be all sort of recognizing that. And a few more things is that size not matter. I really liked, Maru, your statement. For us, small grants is big impact. So we have been seeing that multi-million-dollar projects, I'm sorry, but sometimes we see that with $25,000, we can see even similar or even more, results. And so I really feel that it's not about size, but it's more about, the leadership, the ownership, the sort of involvement of Indigenous peoples. But we do see a gap in between our funding and then also the multi-millions. So we are talking about, can we create somewhere around like 200,000, 300,000, that kind of window, which really helps Indigenous peoples to grow. And in that regard, GF actually established a new window called the Inclusive Conservation Program, which is working with Indigenous people on the landscape scale, which we do too. But I think that kind of small, medium, large sort of progress is also very, very important in terms of coming up with different models. And then lastly, what I wanted to talk about was the risk. Francisco really mentioned that in order to reduce risk, we should work with Indigenous people. That's what you said. And I think we have to bring that mindset more towards the donors, because in our system, I have to say, because we fought for Safeguard, because we fought for FPIC, bringing in Indigenous people is sometimes considered increased risk. Because, when Indigenous people is there, we have to tick saying that there is maybe a high risk or a medium risk that there might be adverse impact to these people. But the thing is, I really think that we should think that this is a risk mitigation measure to be working with Indigenous people, because, this is a nature-based solution. And we can mitigate climate change, biodiversity loss, all these things together. And I really think that, the do no harm risk and the do good risk is a very different thing. And for donors, I think or funders, we shouldn't be considered that Indigenous peoples involving them is more burden or more risk, but, to think that this is an opportunity to have a larger impact. And I think with those few words, I really look forward to partnering with all of you and making a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So she's inviting you. My part, I think you know where the small grants are and how impactful they can be. So let's go to the last session so that we can give people time to ask questions. So I'm sure there are a lot of burning questions for the speaker. So I'll give just because Dr. Sousa had spoken earlier, just a few minutes maybe to add on to what you said, then Gustav will close the discussions.
You know now the profile of Selena, right?
Yeah.
You already cut part of my time on this section. But I'll be very brief because we are behind the schedule. We know that I think it would be important to have this space for having a conversation, exchange. So, but before my comments, I'd like to say that this conversation today is quite important because from my perspective, we are having a brainstorm section actually, from my view. A brainstorm section in terms of the challenge, possible way for us to improve or to strengthen the collaboration between different stakeholders and indigenous people as part of it. So a second point that I'd like to say is based on that, together with the USAID, Sandra EV, we are on the process to organize a side event. At the next COP, we are going to bring the indigenous people as part of the conversation. The conversation today is very important to create the input for us to organize this section during the COP27. So the different points that we start to discuss, especially with the contribution from brothers and sisters on the indigenous people in local community perspective, is we should think that the point is not about the money. Yeah, I agree with Andrea, and Andrea mentioned about this. The conversation here is actually about the potential way, or the possibility, or the importance for us, for the indigenous people in local community to achieve self-sustainable development, to achieve self-governance, for them to be able to achieve their rights. That's the core element. The money is the means for them to achieve that, but the money is not the goal. So for us to be successful on all the discussion, we need to focus on that. We need to create the enable condition actually through the money. Money is going to be one of the components as part of this conversation for us to support them to achieve self-sustainable development, self-governance, for them to achieve their rights. So the Indigenous Foundation, we are a global lead indigenous organization. We cover the planet. We are working in collaboration, not with the beneficiaries. We don't consider the indigenous people organization on the ground at national, regional, and subnational level as or beneficiaries. They are our partners. They are part of the goal, the target mission of the Indigenous Foundation. So we cover the planet. We are talking here about the collaboration of the Indigenous Foundation that we have nowadays over 1.5 billion hectares of the indigenous people in local community territory at the planet. 800 million hectares represent forest, is forest cover. That we can have the idea in terms of the importance for us to bring the indigenous-based solution as part of this conversation. I totally agree with Gillian, and he said that for the indigenous people in local community organization, at some point, we need to discuss it to see carbon market as an opportunity, but connect it to the carbon market to also to think the holistic way how the indigenous people, they manage that territory. Now, on this collaboration that we have, the Indigenous Foundation we do have with the USAID, I'd like to bring very fast in 2 minutes, no more than that, some lesson that I think would be important for us to think. So the idea behind this initiative, that you call the Indigenous People Alliance for Rights and Development, the IPART program, is based on the 3 pillars. A theory of change that if you have the full capacity of the indigenous people organization, they are going to be able to influence different space. But here is not only the capacity of the indigenous people organization, because as I said before, we do have the capacity. We have to manage our territory for centuries and centuries. But at the same time, we should be able to influence different space. We should be able to negotiate with different stakeholders. We should be able to manage the money at different scale. We should be able to think about indigenous economy, indigenous business as an opportunity for us to achieve self-reliance on the long term. That's one pillar. But also is important to think about the capacity of the government, because they need to see how the indigenous people think about it. They need to understand the knowledge, the culture, the value, the vision that the indigenous people have. They have the potential to put on the table as a possibility. The Indigenous Foundation, as part of this collaboration with the USAID, also the Forest Stewardship Council, in the private sector together, we are trying to create this condition for create a platform for land, not only for the indigenous people. If they are able to achieve that, there is a second challenge. The second challenge is how the indigenous people, they could influence the national policy. How could they be able to participate in the space to influence the decision-making process? That's going to be the second pillar for the IPART. is to work together with the government, the other stakeholders, for them to create this space in terms of the collaboration dialogue. Think now that they have the capacity, different stakeholders, not only the indigenous people. They have now the possibility to influence, to create collaborative space. There is a second challenge here. The indigenous people, we can't not live or survive only with money from the donors. We should think about an indigenous economic model that for us to be able to access the market, to create revenue, to create income, for us to have, to achieve actually the full capacity in terms of the self-reliance. That's the third pillar for the I part. We want to create indigenous economic model for them to achieve self-reliance in the long term. So together with that, we also, in the collaboration with the USAID, we have identified that also it's important to bring the indigenous women as part of the process. If you are talking here about the different challenges that the indigenous people we are facing, think now about the indigenous women, and then multiply for 10 or 50. They are facing more challenge. That's why we have a second initiative as part of the collaboration. The main idea is to create the condition to empower it, to have economic empowerment of the indigenous women, especially in Central America. Just to finalize, Selena, the implementation of that, we are working with, so far, with the FAO as a key partners for us, the UN Women as part of this collaboration. The IMPB is part of this collaboration first. Up now, we are in the process also to bring the IPAC as part of this process.
Thank you very much for those few remarks. So let me give the last speaker, Gustav, 7 minutes, and then we open the floor for questions. 7 minutes.
Okay.
Gustav, yeah.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Espero poder transmitir algunas de las impresiones que tenemos al término de la Semana del Clima, después de una jornada muy larga de reuniones, de eventos, muy interesantes todos.
Un momento. I would like to thank you for the invitation, and I hope to transmit or share with you my impressions on the week of climate. They have been very, very productive meetings.
Soy presidente de una organización comunitaria forestal en México que se llama Red MOCAF, y formamos parte de la Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques y también de la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales.
Un momento. Bueno, soy el presidente de la organización mexicana. I am the president of the Mexican Organization for Community Forests. I am also part of the network that is called MOCAV. We are also part of the Meso Alliance Peoples for Forests, and also another alliance for territorial communities.
En esta semana presentamos junto con nuestros hermanos de Repaleac, de Coica, de Apibi, y de AMAN, una iniciativa de financiamiento que se llama Shandia. Es una campaña global de financiamiento, y también presentamos los fondos regionales que estamos construyendo.
Okay, un momento. During this week, with our brothers and sisters, with some of the organizations such as Repalac, Coica, Apive, Ayman, we were talking about the financing. We are part of this program that is called Chambia. This program is a global program, and it also works with regional funds.
Y si bien estamos muy entusiasmados con algunas de las respuestas que tenemos de aliados como CLUA, como Fundación Ford, como la Fundación Indígena del FCC, nuestros amigos de la familia Rainforest Foundation, por mencionar algunos, no dejamos de tener preocupación de que las cosas no están avanzando a la velocidad que deberían.
Un momento. Bueno, okay. In spite of the fact that we are very enthusiastic about the responses from our allies, such as CLUA, the Ford Foundation, FSC Indigenous Foundation, and the Rainforest Foundation, we are very concerned about the slow progress we are seeing.
Y parte de los retos que enfrentamos en temas de financiamiento es realmente construir lo que algunos intelectuales llaman un diálogo de saberes entre el modelo de financiamiento climático ya construido y la realidad que tenemos en los territorios.
Un momento. Okay, so the challenges that we see is especially in financing. There are some intellectuals who talk about a dialogue about knowledge. So we need to have a model for climate financing that actually fits the reality in our territories.
Creemos que ambas partes necesitamos entender lo que requiere la otra. Nosotros estamos tratando de que el financiamiento para pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales sea flexible, no en el sentido de que no tengamos que rendir cuentas, sino flexible para atender las prioridades que hay en los territorios y no las que piensan los donantes que son las prioridades.
Un momento. We need to understand both parties. Each party needs to understand what the other party or the other stakeholder requires. We need to have financing for indigenous peoples and also for local communities. There needs to be flexibility. I'm not talking about flexibility in terms of accountability. I'm talking about flexibility in terms of priorities, to actually see the priorities that exist in territories, not only the priorities donors have.
En los próximos meses somos optimistas respecto a llegar a acuerdos con más aliados para fortalecer estos mecanismos regionales de financiamiento y ojalá podamos llegar a la COP con hechos y no con tantos discursos y promesas.
Un momento. Okay, in these following months, we really want to be optimistic. We want to talk about agreements and we want to talk about our allies so that we can look at regional financing mechanisms. We hope to get to the COP with more facts and not only with so many promises.
También quisiera reflexionar para cerrar esta participación respecto a que estamos trabajando muchas veces solo con donaciones. Y las donaciones pueden crear casos estratégicos, pueden crear ejemplos, pero no son la solución de fondo.
Momento. I would like to make a final reflection before I close. So the idea is not working only with donations. We need to have strategic cases, we need to have examples, and we should really aim at having a deep down solution.
Pero este financiamiento vía donaciones es fundamental para crear casos que sean ejemplos, para inspirar a nuestros gobiernos. Los gobiernos no pueden soltar la responsabilidad que tienen de financiar el trabajo que se está haciendo en el territorio. Ni los gobiernos de los países desarrollados, ni los gobiernos de los países en desarrollo. La cooperación no puede sustituir una política gubernamental que en muchos países está ausente.
Momento. Okay. So we're talking about that donations are key for financing. So we need to have cases that become examples. We actually need to inspire governments. We must remember that governments have the responsibility of financing the work on territories. I'm talking about developed countries, and I'm also talking about countries, developing countries. So we need to make sure that donors are not doing what governments should be doing. Those governments that are absent, they should not be covered but why donors do.
Y finalmente, el tema de los mercados como uno de los ejes de financiamiento. Necesitamos crear condiciones de intercambio equitativas. Coincido con Gillian que los mercados de carbono llegaron para quedarse, pero necesitamos que este intercambio entre la oferta, que es el sur global, y la demanda, que es el norte global, sea equitativa. Si los compradores no pagan un precio justo por los bonos de carbono, estamos creando un mercado de especulación y un intercambio colonialista en términos climáticos. Los mercados de carbono...
Un momento.
Ok.
Sí.
Estoy encerrado.
Un momento. Sí. Okay. So finally, we need to look at markets as the axis for financing. We need to have fair, equitable conditions for exchange. I totally agree with what Gillian said about the carbon market came to stay. So we need to look at the demand and we need to look at the supply. Demand from the north and supply, demand from the north and supply from the south. So sometimes buyers of carbon credits do not pay the fair price. So there can be a speculation. So we need to look very closely at the aspect of colonialization.
Hay estudios de algunos países que señalan que el costo de reducir las emisiones en una tonelada de carbono anda en $25-30. Los mercados muchas veces quieren pagar $5 o $10. Entonces, realmente en los territorios se está poniendo todo el trabajo, mientras que los mercados no quieren reconocer la totalidad del valor que esto representa. Entonces, sí pueden ser una solución los mercados si hay términos justos y equitativos de intercambio. Con esto quisiera cerrar mis comentarios.
Un momento. Okay. There have been some studies conducted by some countries. In such studies, it is shown that the cost to reduce emissions, let's say 1 ton of carbon, it's between $25 and $30. However, the price that we see in markets ranges from $5 to $10. So what's going on? Territories are actually doing all the job and markets do not recognize the value. So what is the solution? The solution is to have a fair market. And I hereby would like to close my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. There are plenty of questions for you, for the things that you just said. I don't want to go into that. So I want to open the conversation to the participants for questions or comments, but please make your question very short and precise so that you can give others also the opportunity to ask questions or to make comments. Okay, thank you so much, people online and the people in the room. I think this has been, I know we had very knowledgeable, skillful panelists that really brought a lot of value to the conversation. Just very quickly for me to say that the few things that I was able to pick up, and we can take those, maybe I didn't pick up everything, is that I think we're talking about new models, really new models to address issues of climate change and nature-based solutions. As donors and partners, we need to think about new models. What do we do differently? Somebody was saying, we've been doing a lot in the last 30 years. Going forward, we want to do the same thing. So we need to look at what are the new models that work, especially for Indigenous people. We also saw the importance of funding for adaptation and resilience for IPs in the Global South, because the Global North wants to emphasize on mitigation, but for us, really it's adaptation and mitigation that works best in these cases. We also saw the emphasis on women. Indigenous women are really critical in conserving nature. Their voices must be heard. We can no longer, it's good that we now have Indigenous people at the table, great, as Dr. Sousa says, but where are the women? We need the voices of those women to come forward. Then there was a lot of discussion on finance. I think we cannot exhaust that, and that is rightfully so, because the topic was about finance, but for nature-based solutions. So we saw finance around, it's not a question of lack of money, but probably it's the processes, it's the stringent regulations that we need to address. We also have issues of length of funding, short funding, 5-year funding, the way we get it doesn't really help. Maybe it has to be consistent, see through a program for a longer time for you to have impact. I think the good example is from Yoko. They have been on it for 30 years, it's working. It's not the amount of money, it's really what that money can do, the impact that it does. Money should not be a tool that breaks relationship, but it's a partnership between the recipient, in this case, the Indigenous peoples, and the donors, and the donors themselves. There has to be strong partnership there. There has to be leadership, ownership by IPs on the issues of money. And I think Francisco also talked about minimizing the risk. You minimize the risk when you bring them on board, that we do these things together. So to access and manage the funds, we need to support the building of the structures. Like Dr. Sena said, structures were broken down by colonial governments. We need to rebuild those structures so that the IPs can, through their structures, access money and manage money better. And now the last conversation here was what kind of funding are we blending? Is it philanthropy, private, public funding? Is it commercial nature, commercializing nature? So a blend, is it a blend or one type, or what do we do? Where do we go forward? Those were the things I was able to take up, and I would like to give Dr. Sousa a minute to close the meeting. Thank you.
So I just want to thank everyone for being together in this very important conversation. So I think again here is the space that we have for think ahead in how would be the different steps that we could implement together with the indigenous people in the best way, in fact, to implement, to put in action the pledge, but not only in terms of the pledge. I think the discussion today is also about the possibility for us to bring together different stakeholders to think behind the pledge. I think that's a very important aspect today, but again, just on behalf of the Indigenous Foundation, the leaders that they are my bosses, I'd like to thank you for being together today, for having this very important conversation. Thank you, Gustavo's, Mayro, and all my brothers and sisters in this conversation. Thank you very much.
So a clap for ourselves.